Well, hi. Welcome back to Risk Management. Today is the first installment of Risk Communication. And in this topic, we'll be dealing and trying to synthesize with our understandings from philosophers, psychologists, and economists about how risk is communicated effectively and ineffectively in the public and private settings. To understand this, I've titled this talk Affect, Risk, and Fear because I think what we'll see at the end of all of these lectures is ultimately what's driving a lot of risk communication and the efficacy of how risks are understood by the public is not cognitive risk and rational risk discussion as we've been having throughout this course, but rather something referred to as affect. And we'll talk about that in the series of lectures coming up. I'd first like to thank a few people who made this lecture possible by providing slides, advice, and other indications and input for it. Robert Sapolsky at Stanford University is a neurobiologist. Daniel Kahneman is a Nobel Prize winner in economics and a psychologist. Paul Slovic is a psychologist who is a world expert in risk communication. And Joseph Ledoux studies the emotions of fear and anxiety as a neuroscientist at New York University. So thanks to these gentlemen for their input and advice about this topic. Oh my goodness, what a cute, beautiful little koala, nestled with her mother in the sage and the eucalyptus branches. What a precious sight. Oh wow, puppy dogs, chocolate labs at that. Such a wonderful sight. The emotions we all have of being a small child with the delight of coming down for a Christmas or Hanukkah present of a small puppy presented to us by our loving parents, nestled at our feet, licking and lapping at our heels. What a beautiful sight. Oh, what a beautiful, precious gift of life to the mother gorilla, her baby nestled in her arms, staring lovingly up. Oh, what is this? Here's a man who suffers from something called hirsutism. Now, notice in the past slides and this slide your immediate gut instinct, if we want to call it that there's a repulsion here that there isn't, even with the baby monkey, where we see this, we somehow are attuned to this is beautiful, and so is this, and so is this, but this is definitely not beautiful, and there's something wrong, and we're put off by it. So that instinct is something I want us to take into account when we're talking about risk communication. Because ultimately, risk communication turns not on the rational, but on the subconscious. And it was your subconscious that told you effortlessly that this man had something wrong with him, whereas this monkey did not. Look at this cute little boy, full of life and hope for the future. So precious, so promising, these small children on a dance floor. Look at this little boy in the leaves. This is something right out of a Norman Rockwell painting. What a beautiful, wonderful, precious gift of life. Precious baby shots of a baby drinking, eating, supping, and nestling his hand against his mouth. Again, a beautiful photo of the promise of future life. Again, how joyous, how wonderful, how precious, perfect Hallmark photos here that we're seeing. Here is a woman, I should actually say a girl, age 11. She has a condition called progeria, which is advanced aging of the cells in her body. So although she's 11 years old, she actually has the cellular age of an 85-year-old. She'll die at a very young age of progressed age because her body ages so quickly. This is a tragic condition that affects a very small portion of the population. Immediately, again, just like the hairy man, we're put off by this photo of there's something wrong. This is bad or not good. And so there's a negative affect that we have when it comes to a photo like this. In fact, this sort of affect has been encoded and enshrined in laws. Here's one from a Milwaukee ordinance that actually said if one is thought of as offensive looking, it's illegal for him to be in public during the day. I'm not sure exactly how that gets enforced. Maybe a show of hands or vote of the people walking by, whether they thought he was offensive or not. But this is sort of recognition of likes and dislikes has codified itself in very strange ways in the past, involving things such as facialism. What I want to talk about, though, for our theory of risk is exactly these emotional reactions of good or bad. So there's a theory that underlies what we're going to talk about in the upcoming classes, and a theory of affect. And when we look to the literature on this, there's no dearth of evidence, says Seymour Epstein, a psychologist, in everyday life that people apprehend reality in two fundamentally different ways. One variously labeled intuitive, automatic, natural, nonverbal, narrative, and experiential, and the other way of thinking is analytical, deliberate, verbal, and rational. So this class has been very verbal. I've talked a lot. We've talked in rational terms and scientific terms about risk. We've been analyzing and very analytical in what we've done. We've been very deliberative and conscious in what we've done. The lectures now are going to expose you to the other side of your brain that thinks in a very different way, effortlessly, non-verbally, with a narrative or story value to it, automatically, that eludes your conscious brain even, and intuitively. It's effortless to do so. It's natural. William Shakespeare grasped this concept when he said there's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. So our brains are pre-inclined to make judgments about things, to say that something is better or worse, to place values of valences and preferences on things. So we see this photo and instantly, you don't need to think, you say that's bad. Right? There's an instantaneous conditioning in your brain. I don't have to force you or persuade you why this is bad, give you reasons or arguments. You instantly recognize it. Same with this. This image has been played time and again. Interestingly, there's been studies done showing that TV exposure post 9/11 led to increases in psychological visits, in psychiatric care and so forth, for people who were overexposed to the media replaying these images time and again of the 9/11 towers coming down in New York. I show you a word like this, instantly there should be some sort of response in your mind about what that triggers. And so I want you to think about, there's two ways that your brain actually accesses information. So let's do the two different ways. 17 times 24 is, right, 408. You got that quickly, I'm sure. Vomit is disgusting. And notice how easy one is compared to the other, how effortless it is to place a judgment on vomit as opposed to doing the computation of 17 times 24. Except for the math savants out there who can do this effortlessly, most of us struggle, and it requires cognitive computation to do that, whereas placing some sort of valuation on like or dislike for vomit, quite easy to do. The responses differ, in other words, in accessibility, how quickly our brains can access that information and give it to us. And intentionally, intuitive accessibility comes to mind without explicit intention or computation. So these images come to our mind and we're able to grasp the affect intuitively. It's something that's sort of almost hardwired into us. So I want to define this term affect that we're talking about here. It's a valenced quality. It's a spectrum from extremely strong to sort of mild and indifferent to extremely negative in the opposite direction, of having either a good or bad feeling about something with any sort of perceived stimulus. Whatever it is that I present to you, you'll have either strong likes or dislikes or some sort of medium spectrum of those sorts of likes and dislikes for something. So affect and cognitive reasoning have also been referred to as System 1 and System 2 in the brain for how we think. System 1 is fast, parallel, automatic, effortless, associative, meaning that we link certain things as having a brand of good or bad to them. And we are slow to learn and unlearn these sort of affects. Once we have fears, they're hard to undo. Once we create fears, they're hard to etch away. And so risks that are learned over time slowly are also slow to be given up. It's also very emotional. And so this is System 1, the affective system of the brain. System 2 is the cognitive system. This is the system I've fought for you all semester long in this class to try to understand, that it's the things that are not necessarily intuitive to us, that we're actually fighting our intuitions to achieve a cognitive reasoning system that's slow, serial, controlled, effortful, rule governed, flexible, and logical. Now, that system is very different than the affective system. It's a rational system, it's a trained system, and it's also not one that doesn't get automatically, intuitively encoded in our brain, whereas the affective system is virtually effortless. You know, even children's books condition us to what's good and bad. Here's a book that's good, that's bad, that goes through on each page and looks at various things. Even if you look in sort of biblical history, throughout the Bible, for example, someone will say, this is sinful, this is not, this is holy, this is not, and so on and so forth. Dietary laws, customs and rituals of even sexual behavior, everything like this. The ritualistic naming of good and bad is something intuitive and found throughout human history. So when we look at affect and we look at information that is paired with that affect, we get a meaning out of it. So affect alone doesn't do anything, but when we pair it with certain information, for example, if we say that something's to be feared or disliked, then that creates meaning for us about that object or thing to fear. And this happens in all sorts of different ways. One of the interesting groups of people to study when you're looking at how affect works are people with a condition called synesthesia. Synesthesia is where people actually visualize colors to define certain things. So somebody might say the word pencil, and they associate a certain color if they're synesthetic with that pencil. Oh, a pencil reminds me of the color purple. And purples have sort of a neutral feel to me, and so since it's purplish in feel, then I'm going to be indifferent to this pencil. And so that's a very extreme example where we have linkages of color and meanings and feelings and affect linked with color that we can then link to certain concrete objects and therefore create an affective meaning to whether something is good or bad. And without affect, information lacks meaning. It would be sort of a colorless world if we just had hyper-rational, sort of Dr. Spock-like thinking, where we were just using our judgment and decision-making, cold computing calculators without any sort of judged valence or like or dislike for things. Affect, we know, is a key ingredient in rational behavior. So there was a man named Phineas Gage who was a railroad worker by any stretch of the imagination, talking to all of his compatriots at the time. Very rational, hardworking, diligent, balanced, temperate man in the 1800s. He had a railroad spike by accident driven through his brain, and miraculously he lived, but his prefrontal cortex was extremely damaged. And ever since then, he had basically lost system 2, the rational system of his brain. He became a completely different animal, according to all of his colleagues. They said, quote, he's no longer Gage. And what they meant by that was he was very much sort of a impulsive, fickle, and illogical man who didn't make plans, who changed himself and his opinions at any given moment very, very frequently, like a hyper ADD type of thinking. And as a result, he profoundly, profoundly lost his cognitive system 2, and his new personality that came out after the railroad injury was the system 1 taking over, the affective system, where he became almost a purely affective human being without cognitive skills. Affect can sometimes lead to very poor decision making, and that's evidenced by the Phineas Gage story again, that he lost all of his ability to make good decisions, ended up losing his position at the railroad and so forth because of his inability to continue to work well. Affect is not cognition. I want to emphasize that. It is something that bypasses our cognition, and yet it seems primary in many ways and is somehow integrated with our cognition. And here's the other important thing, and we'll see this in a future lecture slide. Affect usually precedes cognition. That is, before we can actually start thinking about something, our affect has made judgments about that thing that we're going to then apply rational conscious thought to. So affect moves very quickly. It's a subconscious and faster way of thinking than the cognitive system. We see this even in animals. So for example, if you take rats that are born and bred in laboratory isolation, that is, they're never exposed in the wild to things. Even still, the first time you expose them to a cat, they will freeze, their hair will stand on end, their heart will accelerate. Where does that come from? It's a hardwired affect in the animal to know to fear cats. It's been evolutionarily bred over generations. The animal's not stopping to think, gee, what is this? I've never seen this animal before. Should I be afraid or not? It intuitively knows because of its hardwiring. The same thing can happen if you put a mouse on an open field arena. Mice get scared in the open because of potential predators, so they'll actually defecate and then rise up on their hind feet to sort of fight off or look for potential prey and dip their heads if they're put on a hole board. So there are all sorts of indications that mice are also hardwired in a sort of fearful way under certain circumstances that are hardwired to indicate risk to that animal. Humans have the same sorts of things, certain clear emotional facial reactions to certain smells and tastes. So certain things that are judged to have risk, and this is universal and intercultural. Every culture has the same aversions to certain tastes and smells, no matter where you are in the world, which indicates that humans too recognize risk subconsciously and that they're born and bred to have this recognition of risk, not cognitively, but intuitively. Also, humans have the same sort of thing when we're talking about fear or startle responses to loud noise or stimuli that are very painful. And again, that's intuitive, hardwired, evolutionarily created. It's not something that we learn. So some of these forms of affect are just innate to all sorts of different creatures. And what we're going to see also in the next series of lectures is that affect can be something learned when exposed to certain things where we don't have a prejudgment whether it's risky or not. We can form a judgment of risk and aversion to something in humans by communicating an affective quality about that risk. In other words, by informing people that they should judge it as a risk, people will start to do so. And eventually they stop questioning cognitively, consciously, whether something is a risk or not. It becomes a subconscious, intuitive, habitual, automatic way of thinking. So that's what I wanted to leave you with today, is an introduction to the concept of affect, the idea that we can be exposed to things and that our subconscious has a say over how we judge and how we react to certain things as risks or as benefits, as friendly or as foe. All right, that's enough for today as our lead-off lecture. I'll look forward to seeing you in the next class and on the chat boards.